So welcome everyone in this third Traditional Boats and Maritime Traditions seminar. The seminar series is organized for this academic year only by the project that I'm conducting at the University of Helsinki at the Department of Cultures in collaboration with the Society of Friends of the Museum of Boat Building and Maritime Crafts in Samos. Today, we're very glad to have with us Ziad Morsy, who is a very good friend and dear colleague. He's a maritime archaeologist with years of experience of work and research in the Mediterranean in various settings. He's currently a visiting lecturer and an Honor Frost Foundation scholar at the Faculty of Arts at the Alexandria University in Egypt. Today, he will present a topic related to his PhD research at the University of Southampton, which he submitted very recently, and I'm very excited to hear about. And his title is Nile Traditional Sailing Boats in Egypt. So Ziad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katerina. Hello, everyone, and I'm very glad to be here today to talk to you about the topic that I've been researching for the past 10 to 12 years, actually, which is the Nile Traditional Sailing Boats in Egypt. And basically, what I'm going to present to you today is the outline and the results that I arrived to while doing my PhD research in the University of Southampton, and just submitted the PhD last October, and hopefully the viva will be early next year. So today I'm going to talk to you about the introduction, about the research project itself, the different data resources or sources that I've collected during the lifetime of the project. I started this project in 2016 at the University of Southampton, and finalized it this year, basically. Also we'll talk with you about, or discuss with you about the medieval Nile, and especially starting with the Mamluk period in the Nile boats. And then we will talk about the Ottoman Nile boats. And then I will introduce you to the methodology of typologies and names that I've used, and try to put it together to better understand the different typologies of Nile boats. And we will discuss together the problems of these typologies, and eventually I will conclude with the changes that happened on the Nile boats, and especially the traditions of the Nile sailing boats from the medieval time to the modern time. So Egyptian Nile boats have, or Egypt and the Nile and the Nile boats have been in Egypt since antiquity. So we have a large number of finds of physical boats, from small boats finds to majestic barges of kings and queens of Egypt. And also we have the some of the most picturesque backgrounds or environments in the medieval time and in the pre-modern world, with the invention of photography in the 1800s, and we will discuss this later today. All through different medias and different ages, all through until our modern day Nile, and all the beautiful sailing boats that we still have in existing that are sailing on the Nile in Egypt. So my research aim was to try and understand the aspects of the Egypt's maritime and riverine culture which survived in the traditional ethnographic record, and try to provide a better understanding of the impact of modernization on these local traditions, and to generate a record of the rapidly disappearing traditional riverine cultural material. And so I started with the investigation of the remaining evidence of ancient traditions of sailing boats and small working and leisure boats, and to record and locate the remaining working boats, especially wooden boats, and to determine to what extent these boats rely on local material and local traditions in their construction. And finally, the study of the typology of traditional sailing boats and how it was adapted to work within its geographical context. And the timeline of the research was supposed to be the end of the 18th century, all the way to modern time Egypt. But to be able to understand the 18th century and the late 18th century in Egypt, I had to go back, further back, just a couple of centuries back, to try and put a starting point where the traditions or the different traditions of the Nile might have started from or originated from. So the historic foundation goes back to all the different medieval Arab sources like Al-Asyuti and Maqrizi and the Nawiri Secondary, Al-Qalqashandi, and many other Arab and Islamic scholars and travelers who traveled through the Nile and traveled through Egypt and wrote an extensive accounts about the Nile in Egypt, and also about Nile boats and about the different traditions that the Egyptians had during their times. So in a nutshell, during the Mamluk Nile, during the Mamluk era, the Nile boat typologies included a large number of different names of boats. Sometimes, because of the historical sources, these names or typologies were crisscrosses from each other. So some of the authors might confuse some of these typologies with each others. So in this list is a total list of all the different types that were included during the Mamluk time on the Nile. So we have the Ashkif, Aqaba, the Jarm, the Harraqa, the Dahabiya, Sambuk, Sandal, the Ushari, Feluka, which is this name is very familiar to everyone who comes to Egypt. We still use this same terminology to describe the Nile boats, the Nile sailing boats. But this terminology changed a lot during the time. And other names like the Qayasa, the Ma'una, and the Ma'ash, and the Nagr, all these different types of boats were discussed in the different historical sources from the Mamluk period. But the problem was, until today, we don't have any direct evidence of these boats. So neither the shapes of the boats, the rigging of the boats, or any kind of archaeological material of the boats. So then we start having more advancement in the description of the Nile boats during the Ottoman time, and specifically the great Piri Rais, who wrote his book about navigation. And Piri Rais, in all of his description about Egypt, he included a whole map of the Nile in Egypt, including a number of boats. And also, this is one of the papers or one of the pages from the manuscript of Piri Rais. This one is a modeled version of the original manuscript, and this one is available online. I will give you the link later on today. So in this map, we can see the old town of Cairo, or the old city of Cairo, which is here. And we can see the citadel, the aqueducts of Cairo, and we see the Nile, the pyramids on the other side. So this map is looking south, which is different from what we are used to right now. So the north is going down and the south is going up. And here we can see a number of boats that are very distinctive and they look different than each other. And also we have some writings underneath each of the boats. But Piri Rais helped me a lot with trying an understanding of the different typologies of boats and ships that were on the Nile during the Ottoman time. However, there was another dilemma that I faced during my research, which is the different copies that exist of the same manuscript of Piri Rais. So we have this one, which is from the Hagia Sophia Library, which dates back to 1526. This one is the Topkapi Sarai, and it dates, the date is wrong, so it's 1526. It's the same, but another copy. And this one is in the National Library of France, and it dates back from 1550 to 1599. And if we have a closer look, we have other copies of the manuscripts. So this one is the latest, the one in Walter's Museum of Art, and it's available online. So you can, if you log into the Walter Museum of Art and search for Piri Rais, the Kitab al-Bahari, or the Book of Navigation, it will get you a link to the full book with a high resolution scan, so you can actually admire these beautiful drawings up close. And we have this one, this copy from the University of Istanbul that dates back to the 16th century. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different copies of the same manuscripts. Some of them, they are identical, but the other are not very identical. So if we go back to the newest version, which is the most complete version with all the additions that exist in the Walters Museum of Art. So we have the first boat, which is the Jarem or Jarim. And we can see here, it's a big boat with 3 lateen sails. The other boat, which is the Aqaba, we see a very also lofty boat with a kind of a small castle or a houseboat, as we might call it. And it has 2 very different sails. The first one is a square sail, and the other one, the one in the aft, is a lateen sail. The third type of boat, which is the Qayasa, and we can see here, again, the hull shape is a bit different, and it has only 1 sail, which is a square sail, which is a loose-footed square sail. And the final one is the Shahtur, which is, again, it looks bigger, it has some cargo on it, and it has a square sail, which is boomed with kind of a boom underneath, and with 2 kind of a side rudder or 2 oars, or 2 big oars. So from the Ottoman time, we go back to a different types and different names of Nile boats from the different Ottoman sources, either the official sources, which is basically the official Ottoman records that we have either here in Egypt, in Cairo, or in Istanbul, and also other books that were describing this period of time in the Nile during the Ottoman time. So we have similar names as the names that we got from the Mamluk period, which is again the Aqaba, the Kanjia, the Dahabiya, the Qayasa, the Sandal, and the Ma'ash, we have some similarities of the names or typologies between the Ottoman time and the Mamluk time. But it wasn't until the Muhammad Ali Pasha came to Egypt in 1801 under the Ottoman rule, and everything started to change in Egypt. Muhammad Ali was a ruler, and he was the general of the Ottoman army that came to Egypt to free it from the French invasion that happened in the last 2 years of the 18th century. So Muhammad Ali was the head of a 5,000 men stronghold that was based in Alexandria. He was working with the British Navy to expel the French from Egypt. And then a few years later, he became the Pasha of Egypt, or the Viceroy of Egypt. And the Viceroy is basically like a minister of Egypt, or the head of the state under the Ottoman rule in Istanbul. So Muhammad Ali started to work on the Nile. He changed the trade routes that used to exist on the Nile from Rosetta to Alexandria, and he returned the glory, or the lost glory, of Alexandria to the city again. He started connecting the city with the Nile with a navigable channel, which is the Mahmoudiyya Canal, and all of that because he wanted to become more powerful, richer, and basically be an independent ruler of Egypt away from the Ottoman Empire. So in order to do that, he started a monopoly of the agricultural land, he started a monopoly of timber trade, and he started a monopoly of grain exportation. And he started the first record that we have in the modern history of massive public works that transformed the agriculture of Egypt, and also transformed the navigation of the Nile during the modern time. So Muhammad Ali didn't actually introduce a lot of new traditions to the Nile. He started with building his own boats from the same type that used to exist on the Nile when he came to Egypt. He expanded the Bula Arsenal, which is in Cairo, and he upgraded all the different Alexandrian Western port facilities, including a dry dock and a connection or a water lock between the Mahmoudiyya Canal and the Western harbor. And by that, he made himself the main trader or the main exporter of the products of Egypt. So all the products of Egypt coming from the south of the Nile, from Aswan, from Upper Egypt, all the way to the Delta, are being brought by boats. And these boats are arriving to Alexandria, and then from Alexandria, they would be shipped on bigger ships and crossing the Mediterranean to the Western world, and especially to Europe. So actually all grain boats were owned or operated by the Pasha himself, Muhammad Ali, including, and he was paying for the wages and maintenance of the boatmen on the Nile. He introduced a new reform on the police and assured the smooth movement of products on boats across the country. And by 1840, the number of boats on the Nile doubled between the beginning of the ruling of Muhammad Ali in 1805. By 1840, it became 3,300 boats on the Nile, including about 300 to 500 boats owned directly by the Pasha himself. Muhammad Ali was very enthusiastic and very welcoming to Western inventions. In 1839, he allowed Friedrich Goebel, the first daguerreotype or daguerreotypist or photographer, to come to Alexandria and takes the first ever photograph that we know of Northern Africa. And this is the photograph on the right-hand side here of the entrance of the Ras-Tin Palace in Alexandria. And Muhammad Ali was fond of the technological advancement in the West, and this is why he allowed a lot of the Europeans, merchantmen, scientists, and businessmen to come to Egypt and settle in Alexandria in order to benefit from them and use their inventions and use their connections with the West to enlarge his power in Egypt, and including the enlargement of his naval power in Alexandria. And this was the first ever photograph that was taken on a Nile boat that dates back in the to 1840. So going back to the terminologies and typologies of boats, the main resource that I have of the different typologies of boats was the description of Egypt that was published from 1809 all the way to 1820. And this is an extraction from the part État moderne or modern life in Egypt in page 123. It describes the different boats that navigate on the Nile, the canals, the lakes, and the different maritime routes in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So basically, this was the only page that was included in the huge encyclopedia about the description of Egypt that was included about Nile boats. And this is very weird because the French savants that came with Napoleon, who wrote everything about Egypt, wrote extensively about different ways of lives that the Egyptians or the modern Egyptians back then used to live. And also they wrote a lot about the different traditions that the Egyptians had back then. But for some reason, they ignored the boat building traditions as if it doesn't exist or almost doesn't exist. So as we can see here, they divided the different typologies of boats on the Nile to two categories. One is from Upper Egypt and one is from Lower Egypt, which is the north. So we have the Markib, Feluka, Nusf Feluka or half Feluka, and Feluka Sughayara or small Feluka. And in Upper Egypt, we have the Kanga, Nusf Kanga, the small Kanga, the Qayasa and half Qayasa. And all of these, we have the names from Arabic names and French equivalent, and also the numbers, the total numbers of these boats, and how many sails or the rigging of each of the boats, how big they were, and how long they would be able to navigate on the Nile. So because of all of these different information or fragmented information about Nile boats and Nile boat typologies, I had to go and look for resources and information in other places. And these other places included the travelers' accounts, especially during the 18th century or from basically the 18th century all the way through the 19th century and the 20th century. And I had different categories or types for these travelers. We have the antiquarians or treasure hunters / archaeologists who became archaeologists later. And one of the most famous ones of these treasure hunters is Giovanni Belzoni, who was a strongman, a circus strongman that came to Egypt in the early 19th century. And he actually did a demonstration about a kind of a hydraulic pump to the viceroy, to Muhammad Ali Pasha. But this demonstration didn't work. And then Belzoni decided to start looking for treasures and antiquities to sell it to England and to the British Museum. We have early explorers of the Nile, like James Bruce, who wrote extensively in the late 18th century about reaching the sources of the Nile. We have pilgrims like William E. Barton. We have travelers like Gardner Wilkinson, who wrote extensively about different customs and traditions of both modern and ancient Egyptians. And finally, we have professional tourers like Thomas Cook, the well-known tourer of the East. So these travelers produced a number of different accounts. These accounts were divided into diaries, letters, traveling guides, and traveling accounts. There were hundreds and thousands of these accounts. And through different periods of time, through the research timeline, I tried to collect as much data as possible and from these publications. And I was just focusing on the pieces where they are discussing or describing Nile boats and different typologies of Nile boats. But all of these books, or almost all of them, discussing Egypt had engravings or drawings including Nile boats. But again, there were the problem of the accuracy of these drawings. Are these drawings were real drawings of Nile boats, or were they made by an engraver back home, which is back in Europe? And this problem is very permanent. So most of the travelers didn't even pay any attention to their own boats, that they spend 2 to 3 months on exploring Egypt. And the second problem was that drawings of boats were significantly different from photographs of the same boat during the same time period. Although I managed to find some examples that were very accurate. So, for example, this drawing by Fairholt in 1862 in his book Up the Nile and Home Again. And you can see here, this drawing is actually a copy from a photograph or real photograph by Lekugien in 1890. Again, from Fairholt, another photograph of Nile boats, and a drawing of Nile boats. We can see here a photograph from exactly the same period of time, basically, that depicts the same kind of view. And here we have a drawing by Henry Folkert, and on the opposite side, we have a photograph by Antonio Beito, who is one of the very famous photographers in Egypt during the 19th century. And here we can see the boatman climbing on one of the on the yard of the boat and trying to furl or hoist the sail manually. This is again another photograph from one of my favorite photographer, Francis Frith. And here you can see this kind of display that 19th century photographers had the Egyptian boatmen do in order for them to take some picturesque photographs of the environment in Egypt. And here again, another photograph by Willard Fisk and Jenny and Willard Fisk. And we can see here again, the boatmen on top of the yard, furling the sail or hoisting the sail. So from the different descriptions that I started collecting through the different, from the different accounts, we have, for example, Sir Gardner Wilkinson describe or combines different types of boats or Nile boats, including, again, different names of boats that were used in the Nile. Some of them are similar to the ones from the Ottoman time, and others are not. It wasn't until 1958 that photographs were included in the books of the Western travelers, and the first book to be published as a kind of an album book was the Egypt and Palestine photographed and described by Francis Firth. And he included a number of amazing photographs of Nile boats with some kind of Egyptological temple or an Egyptian background in the background. So he would always have a figure, a boat, and an architectural building or an architectural element to give the viewer an understanding of how big these buildings were and also how big these boats were. So I started collecting, along with the different historical and traveling accounts, I started collecting photographs, old black and white photographs from the start of the invention of photography in the 1940s or the 1930s, and the start of photography in Egypt in 1839, all the way to our modern time. So up until now, I have almost 4,000 photographs of just Nile boats, and they were gathered from almost 200 different online and personal archives. And for this, I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks to everyone who helped in collecting and sorting all of these photographs, because I've used a lot of personal archives of friends and people who I met through the years, and they helped me a lot to try and build this photographic database of Nile boats. So for a couple of years, I used all these photographs along with the description that I managed to collect during the lifetime of the project, and try to categorize or arrive to a different category of Nile boats. So I decided to divide or categorize Nile boats into two categories: working boats and leisure boats, because during the 18th century and the 19th century, this division started to appear. Before that time, both working and leisure boats were mixed together. So normally people would use boats for both passenger carrying and cargo carrying, and sometimes in the festivals, they would use it for leisure. But starting from the late 18th century and the 19th century in particular, this division started to be very obvious from both the historical sources and the photographic sources. So under the working boats, I managed to collect data and information about all these types of boats. I'm not going to introduce you to all of them, but I'm going to use examples from the working boats and examples from the leisure boats. So we have a large number of different types of boats, and each name of this boat is corresponding to a specific type or shape of boats that were on the Nile during the 19th century, from the 19th century all the way to almost the 21st century. One of the main types of working boats was the Qayasa or the Gayasa, which was the working boat of the Nile, one of the most famous types of boat from medieval Egypt to modern time and pre-modern time. So this working boat normally would be a very big, large boat with 2 masts and lateen sails, and normally it would be a flat bottom boat with a very blunt bow, up to 18 meter long and 6 meter wide, and up to 200 tons, and can carry up to 200 tons of cargo. So these are the corresponding photographs of the same typology of the boats. You can see here, it's a flat bottom boat that is almost carrying cargo to its shear line, and here it is over carrying some fodder and cargo, as you can see here, and they came in all sizes and shapes, but again, they are characterized by the 2 masts or 2 lateen sails and the blunt bow and the flat bottom, as you can see here. When normally it would, the hold would be divided into 2 holds, where the cargo is set inside the hull of the boat, but also Egyptian boatmen, until recently and until now, they still stack cargo on top of the boat itself. As you can see here, this is 2 Qayasas that were fully loaded with bricks. You can see them here, and you can see the brick factory in the distance on the right-hand side, and you can see that the water level, or the boat, is filled to almost the water level of the Nile. Here you can see the difference, the depth of the boat. So here you can see one of the boats being built on the shore near Cairo, most probably in Boulat, which is the main harbor, or the main northern harbor of Cairo. So modern Cairo had 2 different harbors or port facilities, one in the north and one in the south. The one in the north is Boulat, which is no longer on the Nile anymore right now. And the southern part, or the southern port, was the old Cairo port, and each port would have their different products that were coming to. So the northern port would have products coming from the delta to Cairo, and the southern port would have products coming from Upper Egypt to Cairo, and then they would crisscross in the middle, and so Cairo becoming the main transit grounds for all the products and travelers navigating through the Nile from south to north, or from north to south. And here we can see one of the boats being built. You can see how deep it is, but in the previous photograph, you can see how low or how small the sheer or the freeboard of the boat is. And here you can see how big these boats were. So we have the boatman and one of the captain and one of the boatmen, and we have the 2 big sails, or 2 yards, lateen sails, and we have another small service boat that was towed behind these big, bulky cargo boats of the Nile. And the Egyptians weren't just transporting people and small cargo, but also they were overcharging or over carrying cargo, especially pottery from Upper Egypt, and grain in sacks, and also cotton. And here we can see from the Australian War Memorial Museum, the Australian infantry were using Nile boats to transport horses or service horses across the Nile. So Nile boats were carrying almost everything through Egypt. From the leisure boats, we have four very distinctive types of boats. We have the Kanja, we have the Dahabiya, we have the Ma'ash, and the Feluka. I'm sure that some of you would have heard of the Dahabiya and the Feluka, because they were the most famous two boats that remained in use. Of course, they were changed, as we will see later on today, but they remained in use until our modern time. The Kanja was built specifically for traveling, and most probably it started appearing on the Nile in the 18th century, and it was made especially for the early explorers of the Nile. So it was very small, slim, and had a small or a low cabin on its aft side, and it had two masts with lateen sails, but also it can be rowed, and it has a very elegant design, and it was very swift in sailing the Nile. So from comparing these descriptions with photographs, we arrived to these beautiful boats. As you can see here, it's very elegant in shape, and with a very low cabin on the second half of the boat. It has two sails. One is a big sail at the front, and another small sail at the aft or at the back of the boat. As you can see here, this is the same photograph from Francis Frith, and you can see here during the low Nile season in Aswan, boats would be sitting on the banks of the Nile, and here we can appreciate the hull shape of these kanjas or these Nile houseboats. We can see here in a photograph by Antonio Beito from 1880s to 1891, a large number of different kanjas that are anchored around the city of Aswan in Upper Egypt. And here we can see another photograph of the kanja. You can see here the very elegant shape of the boat, the two masts with two lateen sails that are not in use. And we can see here the rowers are in action rowing the boat or the ship. And we can see the huge rudder blade with the captain on the helm and the service boat next to the main boat. And here we can see this block is the kitchen of the boat. And normally these this cabins or the low cabin would include 2 or 3 rooms that can accommodate 5 persons or 5 guests. The second type of leisure boats, which is the more famous, and that was actually being used since the 19th century up until now, which is the Dahabiya or the Dahabiya. And it was built for European tastes, and it has spacious cabins that can take more persons. It's bigger than the Kanja. It has also 2 lateen sails, and it can be rowed, but later on, some were made of Clyde steel. So we can see here a photograph also by Bieto from 1880s, and we can see here a dahabiya fully with crew members sitting down on the deck, and also tourists sitting on the lounging deck upstairs. And we can see here that the cabins are getting a bit larger to accommodate more travelers or tourists or explorers. And here we can see one of my favorite photographs by Frank Mason Good. And it dates back to the 1860s, where two big dahabiyas were anchored near Aswan. And we can see here how big the cabins are getting, and also the change that happened between the Kanja and the dahabiya in the terms of the rudder. So the rudder here became a bit smaller, the main mast becoming a bit longer, and the mainsail becoming a bit bigger. Here another profile photograph of one of the dahabiyas, and you can see how many crew members were needed to row and to sail these boats, while the European travelers would enjoy their time staying on this or on their floating home on the Nile for 2 to 3 months during the winter time, especially starting now in November. It's the most favorable weather to visit Egypt and to visit the Nile. But the change started happening in the second half of the 19th century, and especially when Khidewi Ismail, or the king of Egypt, or the grandson of Muhammad Ali, started opening Egypt to Westerns even more, because he had the vision of turning Egypt into a part of Europe, especially Cairo and Alexandria. And in 1869, Thomas Cook did his first tour in Egypt on the Nile, where he brought a number of tourists from England all the way to Egypt and up the Nile and back again, using the local royal mail boats to be accommodated as tourism or touristic boats. And it wasn't until 1870s that Thomas Cook and his son John Mason Cook started establishing Thomas Cook and Son here in Egypt, and they started operating as the main tour operator in Egypt. So they were employing a large number of boats, and especially during 1882, or starting from 1882, and the British invasion of Egypt, Thomas Cook became more powerful and more influential on the Nile traditional boat building, or the Nile navigation in general, because his company was the sole owner of the rights to send the mail of the postal mail across Egypt. And he was the first company to have tours, private tours on the Nile in Egypt. And John Mason Cook stated in one of his speeches that in 1888, the company used to own 2 sailing wooden dahabiyas out of 136 that were employed on the Nile. But in 1893, he owned 13 sailing dahabiyas built with steel hulls on the Clyde. And this took me to a very brief visit to the Thomas Cook archive back in 2017, where a large number of all the different material and all of the different sources about all these boats that were being built in Scotland and then being shipped in pieces, and then they were employed on the Nile. So Thomas Cook would actually commission the building of Nile boats in the Clyde River up in Scotland, in metal sheets, and then these boats would be dismantled and shipped on ships from Southampton to Alexandria, and then from Alexandria, these crates or these boats that are like flat backed, like an IKEA table, in crates would be carried on trains all the way to Cairo, where Thomas Cook established his boatyard in Bula in Cairo. And then there he employed at least 99% of Egyptian boat builders, and these boat builders would rebuild and refit these dahabiyas, weld them together and fit them with local materials, and also include masts and yard and sails from locally sourced from Cairo. And then these boats would be used on the Nile for travelers across Egypt from Cairo all the way to Aswan and beyond. And then later on, Thomas Cook started investing in the building of different types of Nile boats, which is the Weber engine boats, or Weber or side or stern wheel boats, like the one here in this photograph. And this became very popular because it gives the advantage of less time to be wasted, because it doesn't have to rely on the wind or the current. And the second is giving the opportunity to everyone to enjoy the Nile in Egypt, because building these massive boats or massive Weber engine boats or massive ships allowed for lower fares to be paid for this type of trip. While it was right before Thomas Cook, it was very exclusive to be able to go and sail on the Nile. Another thing that was included or added by the Thomas Cook and Son Company, was the tugboats that were included to tug the different dahabiyas that were built by the Thomas Cook Company in Egypt. So this change that happened during the last 2 decades of the 19th century started propagating through the Nile to affect other types of boats that were locally built and also locally operated by Egyptians, including the famous qayasa that we discussed earlier, the massive working boat of the Nile. So these photographs by Frank Hurley, who was a very famous Australian war photographer who came in Egypt during the Second World War, and he stayed for a long time here, and he took hundreds of photographs during the Second World War of Egypt, and this included at least 120 photographs of Nile boats. As you can see here in these 2 photographs, they were all of the Nile boats here are wooden boats, but we started seeing, or I started noticing, this type of boat that started appearing in the first quarter or the second quarter of the 20th century. And these boats actually looks more like the boats that we still have right now on the Nile. These types of boats, the wooden qayasa, are no longer in existence on the Nile in Egypt. So going through different archives and different photographs, you can see here these boats that look from a distance, that look like wooden hull boats, but actually they were made of metal sheets. And here we can see two Nile boats or Nile payasas. One of them is made of wood and the other is made of metal. From a distance, you cannot tell them apart. But once you get near them, you can understand the difference between these hull shapes or the hull material itself. And basically, I developed this skill because of all the thousands and thousands of photographs that I had to look for or look through during the last 5 years. So other than changing the material of the hull, there were a change in the rigging itself. So the rigging started to evolve during the 19th century and 20th century. So during the 19th century, all the boats on the Nile were lateen sail with a loose-footed lateen sail. But by the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, we start seeing boats that are still lateen sail, but with a boom underneath one or both of the sails. And most probably this introduction of rigging was due to the exposure to the Western traditions that was existing in Egypt during that time, especially with the British invasion of Egypt after 1882. Up until this century, our last century, basically, Nile boats or the Nile remained the main artery or the main highway of products and people in Egypt. But sadly, it started to decline right after the 1950s and the 1960s due to a number of different reasons. One of them was building of the high dam. The second was the change in the ideology or the socio and economic behavior of the Egyptian boatmen, because most of the Egyptian boatmen decided to start new careers somewhere else. So we have a large migration number to the so we start having a large migration especially during the 70s and the 80s to the Gulf countries, where boatmen would work in other professions. And also the state sponsored expansion of the roads in Egypt allowed the introduction of road transportation, which became more favorable to Egyptians than using the Nile itself, because a lot of other obstacles were introduced to the Nile. So a large number of locks were introduced, a large number of bridges were introduced across the Nile that actually hindered the smooth navigation of Nile boats across Egypt from south to north. And these remaining few boats or Nile payasas are still being used, but in a very small way. And these boats, these photographs was taken from a small village about 20 kilometers southern of Cairo, where a number of boatmen in a village still using these boats for carrying small cargo of hay and small products, local products from this village and transported to Cairo. So actually long distance cargo shipping with sailboats stopped or declined incredibly from the 80s and through the 90s all the way to now. So the question of my thesis was, what killed Nile boats? And actually that's the title of the thesis itself. And what killed Nile boats was a large number of reasons, from geographical to socio-economical to modernizing of Egypt. All these different aspects played a crucial role in the changing of the tradition, or the Nile tradition, the Nile navigation tradition. And second, it changed the way that we Egyptians perceive sailing on the Nile. And the third is change the navigation on the Nile. So now all of these cargo boats that we see here in these photographs are being transferred into leisure boats or cabin boats to be used by modern tourists in Upper Egypt. So again, these boats didn't die away or die off. They actually were transferred and transformed into another version of themselves. But I don't think that these are going to survive more than 10 or 20 years of time, because actually sailing on the Nile is becoming a very rare skill, and not a lot of boatmen, current boatmen on the Nile knows how to sail a boat. They know how to navigate a boat, a motorboat, but actually they are not being taught as they used to be by their fathers and grandfathers to sail with Nile boats. And this is a total of the rise and decline of the number of boats. So currently we have a shy of 1,000 total Nile boats on the Nile, and actually about less than 700 sailing boats, including the majority is made specifically for tourism or the use of leisure on the Nile. The remaining are either dying or decaying on the sides or the banks of the Nile. So we can see here a very drastic change in the number of the Nile boats that started declining during the 60s and the 70s. And then we had a shooting or an increase in the number of boats. But this increase in the number of boats was not reflected on the personal boats, but more of a cooperative kind of boats that were built for navigating the Nile or carrying cargo on the Nile. And then from the late 80s to 90s, it started the decline, and now it's even declining even more right now. So we have less than 700 sailboats on the whole Nile that were registered on the whole Nile in Egypt. And with that, I reached the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm open for any kind of questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ziad. That was like really fascinating, and you've done so much work and all of the photographic archives. Oh my God, the database seems fascinating and really hard work. I'm sure you managed to gather all this information and data. Let's move on to the discussion. So
yes.
Feel free, anyone in the audience, to open up your microphones or cameras to ask Ziad any questions. I'm aware there are a few questions on the chat too, but maybe let's start to see who wants to ask something here, and then we can, of course, monitor the chat as well.
Yeah.
I think Zainab, you can ask Ziad. Feel free to open microphones and cameras.
Thank you very much for this. I don't know, it's fascinating. I'm just mind blown because coincidentally I'm also an architect, and I'm doing a semester exchange at Aarhus University in Denmark on sustainable heritage management, and I was covering the topic of Nile boats because nowadays it's a hot topic with what's happening in demolishing them. And it kind of made me feel your PhD is reviving again this and the history of it. So I'm thinking of you must take this into some sort of interactive map and to when you've mentioned like Australian Memorial Museum and all of that, like it's just fascinating to hear your thoughts on how you're taking this forward, but to also kind of maybe a topic that relates to what I'm interested these days, because I'm working on publishing something related to like heritage at risk for example for Nile boats. I was just wanting to ask you, what do you think could really be done about like in terms of how to use data and evidence that these boats date for almost 100 or more years, so they technically they verify and they're validated as heritage in terms of like UNESCO and international standards. But then again, you find national policy agendas moving for their destruction. So I would love to hear your thought about this. And I know it's pretty sad, but again, we're trying to be here action oriented and constructive in a way. Maybe we push them to do something, save a few boats, if not all, but at least save a few. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Zainab, for your comment and question. So basically, I started this research as a start of a master's thesis in 2012, 11. And since then, I've been working on it, trying to reach a way of at least recording all this heritage. So this is why I relied a lot on the archival resources from other places. And actually people, especially people from outside of Egypt, they are very fascinated of the Nile boats, but sadly the local communities are not very aware of their heritage. And this is where it comes to people like you and me to try and raise the awareness about this in the local communities. And I'm really trying to do so with local communities in Upper Egypt. So another project that I worked on just before the COVID was recording tangible and intangible heritage of the Nile. And we managed to actually record one of the oldest Nile boats, wooden boats that's still in existence, but it's not being used. It's just a discarded boat, or a boat that was stuck on the bank of the Nile for the last like 60, 70 years. We managed to record that, and we managed to make contact with the old boatmen on the Nile that they have their own group. So we are trying to raise awareness for the new generation of boatmen, because most of the boatmen on the Nile right now, they only go and get certified by the Egyptian government on motorboats. They know nothing about sailing the Nile. They don't know nothing about sails. So it goes back again to the local communities. And I think the only way forward is by outreach and doing local initiatives with the local communities across the Nile, and have a kind of a display of what we have and the opportunities or the missed opportunities that we still have in Egypt. A number of Egyptologists and tourists, actually Europeans specifically, they managed to revive some of the 100-year-old dahabiyas on the Nile, and they are still being in use in Upper Egypt, especially in Isna until today. But again, they are like 3 or 4 of them. These are from, they managed to record and salvage some of the old relics of the dahabiyas that were left on the banks of the Nile, and then they remodified them, and they have them for as a leisure boats right now. But again, we cannot force feed heritage and traditions to people. People need to be more aware, and this awareness will come only with us giving knowledge to the locals, and this is what I'm trying to do. So I always go to Upper Egypt to do talks with the local communities, try to do outreach, try to do talks, not just in English, but I do a lot of talks in Arabic. But again, being from Alexandria, I'm technically an outsider from Upper Egypt, for example. So we need more people who are local, who really keen to preserve the heritage of their immediate ancestors. So here we are not talking about ancient ancestors who are like 5,000 years ago. Here we are talking literally about the previous generation, so their fathers and their grandfathers and their uncles and cousins. So I think people would be able to understand and appreciate this more. There is a big problem in Cairo, of course, with the boats on the Nile. But again, this is due to this kind of, the Cairenes are very away or very distant from the Nile. They don't use it as much. They use cars more, like what we all do. So this distance between the interaction between the people and the Nile created this void in the middle. And this is where tradition is dying or being neglected. So hopefully we can do something. So I'm very open to collaborate. So we can communicate later on, and we can see what we can do together.
I would love to. That would be my pleasure. Thank you so much for your insightful comments.
Thank you, Zeno.
Kostas, do you have a question for Ziad?
Yes, thank you, Katerina. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Ziad, for this excellent talk and the presentation of the Nile boats. There are many subjects that we can discuss and questions that we can pose. I would like to focus on two things. The first one is the boat building techniques they use in Nile. And one thing, for example, that puzzled me is that in a photograph, I think that I realized some kind of stitching technique, some kind of sewing. I don't know if there was something like that or was a decoration. And the other question is how much we know that Egypt has a great tradition on boat building, both on Nile boats and on Mediterranean boats. How much these two traditions were influenced each other, and how much was they had things in common and things in difference. I remember once I was in the Lake Borolos, and I saw two boatyards. One was on the side of the Mediterranean, and the other was on the side of the lake. They had different things to build. They had different types of boats. But they were neighbors. So how much that influence each other? And the third question, the point, I don't say anything else, is you present a kind of typology of boats in Nile. In other places, for example, in Greece, that's where I'm working, is we have two kinds of typology. We have typology on rigging and typology on hulls, on the boats. Is it something similar in Nile, or the typology is related to both hull and rigging? Thank you.
Thank you, Kostas, for these questions. So to start with the boat building technique, actually they were all decorative kind of zigzag things. I couldn't until now, I couldn't find any traces of sewing except in antiquities in the Nile, or during also 18th century and 19th century, but in the Red Sea. There is no sewing planks on the Nile so far, from what I've seen. So from medieval time, there were sewing boats, but they were exclusively in the Red Sea. And that would lead us to the second question, which is the tradition. The tradition is very, very different. So, and this is why in my thesis, in my research, I just focused on the main water body of the Nile, or the valley of the Nile itself, because the traditions of the main Nile is very different than the traditions in the Delta, and the traditions of the Delta are very different than the tradition in the Mediterranean, and the tradition of the Mediterranean is very different of the Red Sea. So we have, Egypt is very, we have a lot of water bodies. Each water body had its own tradition, in its own local traditions. And as you managed to see, especially in Borolus, you have the open sea boatyards and the lake boatyards. And both of them are very different than the boats that navigates the Nile itself, because they operate in a very different environment and by different ideology and different methodology. So basically, to answer this it's yes, the traditions is very different. And it's not just different in terms of the boats themselves, the shapes of the boats or the rigging, but it's also different in terms of the terminology. So I face a lot of problems to understand the terminologies in Upper Egypt, for example, because I come from Alexandria and we have totally different terminologies here in Alexandria. And the terminologies here in Alexandria are a bit different than the terminologies or the maritime terminologies in the Delta. And this is where I'm trying to collect a kind of a lexicon for both parts terminologies in Egypt that address the different terminologies between northern part, so Mediterranean, northern part, Delta, and Upper Egypt and the Red Sea, because each of them have their own kind of terminologies. So going to the third questions, to answer your third question about the typology. So basically, yes, I followed the rigging and the hulls, but they were intertwined. So in each category or each boat type, as much as I could, I followed or traced the evolution in both the hulls and the rigging, so, because they were intertwined. So for example, for the dahabiya, they were wooden dahabiyas, and then they changed them directly to metal dahabiyas, and that's it. So it's again the same, exactly same boat, but it is bigger and made with a different material, but they were using the same masts, the same sails, with using the same technology. Of course, the flotation is a bit different, but again, the small wooden dahabiya would weigh or do a displacement of a bigger metal dahabiya because wood is heavier. Again, with the qayasa, which is the main carrier of the Nile, it's exactly the same thing. It was wooden qayasas. Then the evolution happened first for the rigging. So they introduced the booms mainly. That was the major difference in rigging. And then the hulls were transferred from wood to metal because metal sheets started being manufactured locally in Egypt. So they were way cheaper than wood because, you know, Egypt is not a very good source of wood for building boats. So this is why I took the approach of the two intertwining together. So I hope I answered your questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Katerina, you're
I know, sorry, I just realized. Based on what you were saying on Costa's question, I have a question. Like when the transition happened from wood to metal, what happened to the boat builders? Like, did they suddenly like start building with metal, or like how did the knowledge change?
So basically, from the accounts, because again, this study was, nobody did the same study ever before, except only one scholar who did it, who did a similar study 100 years ago, exactly, like in 1918, 1920, where he studied just the terminology of boats and ships in Cairo. But the transition most probably happened during the early 20th century. And I have some accounts of boats being discarded. So the wooden boats, so the owners of the boats would go to this like a kind of a boat graveyard, where they discard the boat, the wood, and then the wood is being chopped and being used for fire. And the funny thing is, this fire was made to establish the road, so to make tar for the roads that actually substituted the boats in transporting cargo. So first, people would just destroy their boats because there is no use for them. Some people would reuse the wood, the timber itself, in building as building materials, but it depends on where they are. So the people in Upper Egypt, they would do recycling of the wood. So I've seen in the project that I led 2 years ago, we've seen the reuse of the rudder, the sail, the mast, and the yard inside of the house of the boatman himself. So he uses the mast itself as a stanchion for the roof. He uses the rudder as a kind of a door for the chicken coop that he has, things like that. But the majority would just destroy the wood or sell it as firewood. And then they would either buy a metal hull boat, which is, again, it doesn't have to, you don't need a very, you don't need much knowledge, like boat building knowledge in order to build a metal boat, because building a metal boat is just welding the boat itself. So basically they became metal or blacksmiths, basically. So they changed how they do things. So instead of a hammer, they are using a wheel, like a wheel torch. But then there is another change that happened in the 60s and the 70s, especially, that governmental sponsored movement to introduce a new diesel engine Nile carriers was introduced in the late 60s and the early 70s, where a lot of the boat owners of different boats, they would go and sell or discard their boats as pieces or as a scrap metal or as scrap wood. And then 5 or 6 boat owners would take their savings and buy this new diesel engine carrier, which is a bit of a very, boring, flat bulk carrier, basically. And these bulk carriers still being used until today on the Nile, but it's way less than 1% of the total cargo transported in Egypt is being done by these boats. So the tradition completely shifted to this new tradition. Of course, some of the people retain the traditions for smaller boats, but then eventually, especially during the last 10, 20 years, everyone started building metal boats because metal is cheaper, is way less hassle to build, and also it will live longer. And it's basically because of the environment of the Nile, where the channel of the Nile is changing. So you always hit the bottom of the Nile. So then making it with metal hull is much better than building a fiberglass, for example. I'm following up on Lucy's question.
Yeah, comment.
Yeah, so this is why we don't have fiberglass on the Nile, because normally you beach your boat on the bank, and the metal hull itself is way less maintenance and it will live longer. And also it's easier to build and cheaper here in Egypt, because we have a lot of factories, iron factories or steel factories, where you can just go to the factory and ask them, I need you to build me this boat, and they will do it in like a couple of days in metal sheets, basically.
Right, yeah, that's very interesting. Lucy, I think, had some more questions, and I see there's also Costas made a comment, what type of wood and from where. You can both feel free like to open your microphones and ask more directly, Ziad.
Yes,
Hi.
thank you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Costas.
Sorry, Lucy. The question about wood, we spoke about wood a lot, but where this wood comes from, and what type of wood? In the past, of course.
Yeah. Lucy? I think you have you know the answer.
You want me to
Yes,
to
please.
answer that?
So to introduce everyone to Dr. Lucy Saman, my dear colleague, and what she did for her PhD is basically I did the continuation of what she did. So she did a kind of a study of the sources of the wood in Egypt, like in the Red Sea region, but focusing also in Egypt, and she did a full survey of that. So Lucy, go ahead and enlighten us, please.
Thank you, Ziad. So what I looked at in my research were mainly classical sources and medieval sources coming mainly from Arab-speaking authors. So, and as Ziad quite rightly expressed, that different areas have different traditions in building or living tradition in building. This applies also to wood provenance. So you would expect to have Mediterranean species imported on the Mediterranean coastal boatyards, such as Borulus, Alexandria, Rashid, and so on. So mainly these would be pine for long strakes. And then in the Red Sea, you would have more of a Western Indian source, that is wood types coming from East Africa and from the Indian subcontinent, whether this is, modern Bangladesh or in the Indus area, in the Indus Valley, or India itself. Now these wood export centers also varied with time due to political decisions. For example, India in the 1900s imposed a veto on exporting teak wood, for example. So it really depends on where you are geographically and how the political and socioeconomics of the times were, if that makes sense. Now, the other thing that I found in my thesis, and I'm going to say that Egypt has good wood resources, and this is something that contradicts most of the writing about boat building in Egypt. In most of the boatyards that I visited, you've got the main core of the boat that was built with local species such as acacia, they call it sant, such as mulberry, they call it toot, such as cedar nabak, this is the Sisyphus spina Christi. You've got also a lot eucalyptus, which is the eucalyptus, it's reddish wood. I forgot the vernacular name now. It will come to me. So that's, and of course, again, it depends on the periods, because the use of eucalyptus was not done earlier than the 1800s, because it was when it was imported from Australia to Egypt. There's the use of mango as well, but mainly they use sant and toot in there. So basically acacia and mulberry in there. Oh, and you've got some trees that are locally provided. So you have landowners that plant these trees in their lands in order to sell them for boat builders, right? And this goes in the Red Sea area and the Mediterranean coast. So the use of local wood is the kind of the common denominator between these two major ways. As for the river on the Nile, I haven't targeted the area myself, but I know from the classical sources, for example, Strabo speaks about boats built with acacia boats, wood, sorry. So this you know, even in evidence from the Pharaonic period shows a lot of wood that has been identified as, you know, brought from Lebanon or brought from Turkey or Cyprus or the Southern Europe, but it doesn't make sense because you find the same species in the flora of Egypt and they are endemic to Egypt. So they have always been there. So why would you go, you know, all the way to Lebanon or Southern Europe and while you've got very good, strong, durable wood in Egypt itself. So I hope I answered the question. Now it's going to be another another lecture from my PhD, so I will stop here. Kostas, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, you answered my question.
So also to follow up on Lucy's comment and answer about the plantation, especially under Muhammad Ali, a massive plantation was done under Muhammad Ali, and actually these forests were being used during 19th century, 20th century, and up to our modern time. Especially the Acacia nilotica species of wood or sont, which grows to be like very big and sturdy tree, and actually they were mainly being used by the 19th century boatyards and 20th century boatyards, because Muhammad Ali started this forestation, let's say, plan or project, because he almost deforested the whole of Egypt in his quest to build his navy and in his quest to build all these public works. And then he turned to Anatolia, to southern Turkey, for wood. But then later on, he said, okay, if I have problems with the Ottomans, then I need to plant more local woods. Then he started the process of planting these forests in 1820s, basically. And yeah, so I think
actually, Ziad, in the 12th century, the historian Ibn Mamati, I don't know if you looked at his work.
No, that's beyond my scope. Beyond my timeline.
Yeah. So, but he, he says he has his whole book about forestry and Egyptian forestry and the administration dealing with wood supplies and how back then it was so we're talking 12th century, yeah. So in the middle medieval period, and still, from back then, forestry was administered by the state, and sorry, my dog. And some of the forests owned by they were called. It was administered mainly by Beit al-Mal, so it's the public treasury, yeah, that owned the forests, and it was basically dividing the acacia forest into, okay, this goes to building boats, this goes to building ships, this goes to use as firewood, and they would provide timber to Upper Egypt at Kos or Kous, Beni Suef, Minya, and so on. So that would be interesting if you want to look for, previous administrations
you need to publish your
timber,
thesis, Lucy.
Yeah, yes,
that's very interesting.
You need to publish your thesis. We need that.
I know. I'm sorry.
Lucy,
I know.
sorry.
One day. One day.
I'd like to ask you, Lucy, you mentioned species of wood or just any kind of wood in this 12th century? Yes. 12th century.
Mainly acacia. But there was also the other local timbers. Yeah, I can get you eventually the exact species, but mainly acacia, because until now, boat builders that still build their boats from wood prefer acacia because it's very resistant and durable. So it's resistant against any type of biological or mechanical degradation. But they also sometimes, it's very, and this is something that I think that it's very personal and subjective as well. And this is something that we don't know from the archaeological record, right? Is that the boat builder chooses, he'd rather use tooth here and not acacia for personal reasons, or because he thinks that this is the right wood that needs to be used. Some other boat builders tell me acacia, no, not at all. We use, mulberry, because acacia, once it's dried, game over. You can't, it's not supple anymore. It's not workable anymore. So it also depends. We need to factor in always, I think, the human agency and the human choice in these what we call, traditions.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Lucy. You were also asking about turning Egypt into a part of Europe. In what sense? In the literal
yeah,
sense.
that's yeah.
So basically, Khedive Ismail in the 60s, 1860s, he turned Cairo, and this is what we know of the Khedivial Cairo. So it's downtown Cairo right now. It's basically the European Cairo. He actually wanted Cairo to be part of Paris. So it would be a reflection of Paris on the Nile, basically. So he literally did it as if. So basically what he did, he demolished everything in the middle of Cairo, where this is where Tahrir is and the Egyptian Museum is, and all of this building. So basically he demolished everything there and he rebuilt it from the ground up to look like Paris, basically. But he went bankrupt in the meantime. So he couldn't realize all of his dream. But this reflected a lot on not just Cairo, but on Alexandria also, and the main cities in Egypt, all the cities in the Canal district, so the Ismailia, Boursaid, and Suez, they also reflected this kind of tendency to be part of Europe. So again, there is a whole big discussion about this Europeanizing of the Egyptian traditions, basically.
That's very interesting.
Okay, so it's not inviting Europeans to take over.
No, it's basically building a part of Europe in Egypt where Europeans and Egyptians can live in harmony and can basically benefit the country. So this is his reason, but actually this led to the occupation of Egypt in 82, basically by the British eventually.
That's very interesting. Any other questions for Ziad or any comments? Nothing? It was really, really interesting, and you've done so much work. Like, it's really amazing. I'm looking forward to looking at the final product too, which you should also publish when it's all completed because it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of work, and especially this photographic also database from all the personal and public archives. It's amazing. Okay, thank you very much for being here, and thank you everyone for attending. The next seminar is going to be on the 7th of December, so just in a couple of weeks, and we're going to have Alison Nielsen from Portugal talking about traditional boats and fishing in that region. So you can put this on your calendars if anyone is interested. Thank you again, Ziad, and it was really, really nice to see you.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I really have enjoyed this and enjoyed the discussion. So thank you, Katerina, and thanks, Kostas, and Lucy for attending. And thanks for everyone who attended and collaborated in this discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And
okay, so hope to see you soon.
yes.
Bye.
Bye.